Hello, I'm Javis Lewis, and in this episode I'm going to show you how to create a fly-through camera in DAZ Studio. I've done this for a couple of personal projects that I did recently, small animations. One was a fly-through through Stonemason's Urban Future 6 set, and the other one was also a Stonemason set, which was the Tin Pan Alley set that I've used to animate that little dancing mouse with the Mixamo animations. So I thought I'll show you my process and how I go about creating such a camera, and I'll show you that with another Stonemason set appropriately, which is Urban Future 5. I've got it here loaded up in DAZ Studio already, and I'm in the default position that I'm being dropped in here, and I can just look around, and there's a lot to see, but it doesn't really help to get an overview of where I like to move the camera. So to get a better idea of what the set actually looks like, I like to walk around in it using the keyboard and mouse navigation. I've got the keyboard navigation switched on here already, and I've got the mouse navigation switched on already with the Scene Navigator tool. That means when that's active, I can't actually select anything, but when I left click and drag, I can look around with the mouse. And with the W key, I can walk forward, and then I can walk forward and look up if I wanted to. So this is a bit of the navigation that we get in first-person shooter games or third-person navigation games on the keyboard and mouse controls. That's exactly what we have in DAZ Studio as well. And it allows me to get a better view of what the set looks like and the important points I may want to focus in on when I do that animation. So if the walk speed is too fast or too slow for me, I can utilize my tool settings. If I open them, with the Scene Navigator selected up here, I can see that the speed for the move controls and the look controls can be changed. So the default is, I believe, 5, which is very slow. I can just type 5, hit enter, and sadly that text input field does not lose its focus. So you're just going to have to leave the cursor in there and click back into the viewport, and then that will lock that value in until that cursor is no longer flashing. Little bug there in DAZ Studio, hasn't been fixed in many years, probably won't be in a while. So now I can see that I'm walking very slow, so that's 5 is probably a little bit too slow for me. Perhaps I'll try 20 and just click out of that, and that will have adjusted my walk speed. So I'm thinking perhaps to get a bird's eye view of the scene so that I can establish it, I want to be perhaps up here, something like that. Yeah, that might work. If I go from here, I'm just practicing here to get a bit of a visual aid there. I go down here, I probably won't dive down below this arch, but I'll just go and fly around here. If this is a bit too slow now, I can just always increase it. Perhaps I'm going to use 30. I'll dive underneath this beam, and then perhaps I'm going to go and end up on this poster, pause there perhaps for a second, and then I'll go slightly forward, perhaps revealing this, and then perhaps ending up on this dancing lady in the club or whatever it is here. So that's what I'm thinking of doing. So to get back to the first position, I can just go and fly there if I wanted to. There is another way of doing it. I can place a dummy object just about where I'd like to be there. I'll do that by selecting the whole set and selecting the square button, and that'll show me the whole set now, probably from the wrong perspective here. But if I wanted to put that dummy object somewhere here, then I can always go there very quickly. Why don't we do that? Let's go back to the universal tool and then create a primitive, perhaps a sphere, that'll be created somewhere in the default position. I can select it and then just go and bring that up until I see it. There it is. And then move that closer to the building, perhaps bring that down and probably kind of towards me a little bit. Something like that. If I now go and click that square button onto the sphere, then I'll see it in its position and its relation to where it is. There, just about somewhere here. So that now makes it easy for me. If I go and select the sphere, click the square button, then I'm kind of in the starting position of the camera. Not exactly, but somewhere in the vicinity. I can make that invisible, and then I can start setting up my first shot. Now for that, I'd like to be a little bit wider, first of all, so that this doesn't happen, but also that I can reveal some more of the buildings on the bottom there. So what I can do is right-click on the little loop icon, and that'll make my shot wider or more zoomed in. So I'd like to be a little bit wider here, something like that. That's just for me to get a feel of it. And now I can go and try that simulation again. While I'm doing that, I'm going to keep an eye on the timing of my animation. So if I'm shooting at 30 frames a second and I like for this to happen at a certain speed, then I'm thinking perhaps this whole journey from here to there will take me about 10 seconds. That's just a guesstimate, that's just a guess of mine. But if that was the case, and I'm shooting at 30 frames a second, those would be 300 frames. And then from here over to there, perhaps that's going to be another 5 frames until we come to a complete halt on that. So that's a 15-second animation at 30 frames a second. That's 450 frames. Let me type that in so I don't forget that. On the total, I'm going to type 451. That's our 450 frames plus 1, which is the magic frame 0. That's usually left alone in animations. And now I can literally set up my camera and set this whole thing up. But it's important to understand that this is the thought process that you're going to have to go through. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a 2-second animation or one that is, 20 seconds, where you really want that to be much shorter. So I'll park my camera kind of manually about here. And now I'm going to create a camera out of this, from this shot. So I'll head over and say, create new camera. I will copy the active view, perspective view. And now I can go and switch over to camera 1 here. There's these two things. One is that the camera needs to be selected for any keyframes to be registered at the bottom here. And the second is that if you want to use the keyboard and mouse navigation to set up your camera, you need to actually look through the camera for those changes to be locked in. So I think as a first shot, this may be a little bit too low. I think I'd like to be a little bit higher. So I can either try and do that with my keyboard, like so. That gets me higher. Maybe that's a little bit too high. Or I can either go switch back to the perspective view and then have a look at the camera, tumble around it, and then I can just use the 3D manipulator tool with the camera selected. So I can then switch over to the universal tool again, that this little guy shows up, and then I can move the camera further up or down. That allows me very precise control. I like doing that in conjunction with the parameters tab open, and then perhaps in translation and rotation, so that I can make precise adjustments while I do that. We'll come back to that in a moment with a little issue that we're probably going to encounter. But for now, I'll leave it where it is, switch back over to my camera, and now on my first frame, I know this is the first frame, I like to go and switch my playhead to, say, about frame 300. Just about, doesn't have to be exact, but that I know is 10 seconds in elapsed time. So that means now I'm going to create a second keyframe by positioning my camera where I'd like it to be at that moment. It doesn't matter that it'll go through objects here, but it will allow me to plot a straight path from my initial position to the last position. So once again, I'll go over and select my Scene Navigator tool, and then I'll go and point literally straight at my object that I'd like to end up on. That's perhaps here, perhaps with a yellow in the background. Let me go slightly further down, like so, and then reveal this or that, maybe this. There. I like for that shot to look like this. Now before we set up the last shot, let me just see what the camera does when I move the playhead between those two keyframes. Oh dear, I'm getting dizzy just looking at this. So it looks like what the camera's doing here is it's rotating around one of its axes, and that's not exactly what I want. But sometimes DAZ Studio does get confused when you set these things up, and that's usually because one of the rotational values goes beyond 0 and then goes from positive into negative. That's easy to fix. Let's go to move between these two keyframes, and with the parameters tab open on the rotational tab, let's have a look which value freaks out here. It looks like it's just one axis. Sometimes it can happen that it's two axes. In my case, it's the x-axis. So let's park it on frame 0 and have a look at the rotation here. It's 136. Let's make that 130, just so that we have a round value. We can always make fine adjustments later. If I go back to my next keyframe, I can either scroll through or I can use this little button here, which means skip to the next keyframe. This one is skip to the previous keyframe. Then I'll end up straight there. And here my rotational value is minus 178. Well, I'm going to make that 130 for now, and that may not be exactly the right value, but it now means that if I move between these 2 points, there's no camera rotation there anymore. That's perfect. And now, instead of using my viewport tools to look up at that object again, which now gets me back into the negative range, I'll go and undo that. I'm going to go and use the slider to twist the x-axis to the point at which I'd like to look at. So that's just up a little bit. And now we see that this is actually now the positive value. I didn't want to go into the negative at all, and it looks like there was no reason to do that. So now the camera no longer rotates. That's perfect. It looks like my other values also shifted slightly, which I believe was, look at that, as soon as I touch the viewport controls again, it goes into the negative range again. I think I want it to be about here. So that's fine. I'll just do that with the values in the sliders here as well. Let me undo that and go and move the Y rotation over to here. So remember that. This is a good point to remember. If you have these issues, then it's probably because you're adjusting the viewport with the Scene Navigator tool rather than the slider. So for fine adjustments, use the sliders here. The same goes for translation. If I want to be further on the ground now, I can go and use my translation tool and just tweak the Y rotation. So perhaps I want to look at this from the ground further. So I do that, and then I go and point up and perhaps slightly further to the left at that point. Maybe that's a good shot. So now we have this interpolation between my first shot, which looks nice, and the kind of almost last shot that also looks nice. Anything in between is currently being interpolated by DAZ Studio, and we need to set additional keyframes to make that look extremely handsome. But let's move on to the final keyframe now and go move the playhead to the very last frame, and then just like before, we're going to go and see if we can move forward slightly, and then perhaps also use the slider in anticipation of avoiding this mistake. Turn around to the blue dancing lady, move forward a little bit, and tweak down as well. There we go. Move forward even further and just lock in that last shot. Perhaps that's nice. Let's see what the interpolation is between the last keyframe and the previous one. This looks good. There's no artificial strange camera rotation going, so I think we can leave those things in there. There's another rule that I like to apply, and that is use as few keyframes as possible. So right now, between here and there, this is not the best pan, so we can refine that, but I warn you against putting 20 keyframes in here. Maybe one will solve our issue, which is probably just about here, but we'll come to that in a moment. I think I'd like to dive underneath one of these beams. This one is probably going to be a little bit too close, but I think I can dive underneath this one. So I'll move forward a few frames to about maybe 80 or 90 frames, at which point I would like my camera to be much further down already. I can set this up easy by creating two viewports, maybe one on top, one on the bottom. So the top one will be my camera one, and the bottom one will be my perspective view. If I click in there, just click in there once to make it active, with the camera selected, I can use the square icon to frame up on the camera. I can also select my universal tool now so that I can move the camera, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Zoom out a little bit, or I should say dolly out a little bit, and then just bring the camera down. I can also use the translation sliders in the parameters tab here. That's also possible. And just move that down to about here. Now at that point it looks like I'm not exactly centered, so I'd like to look further ahead. That's a rotation thing again. So Y rotation, Move that up to about here, and X rotation to just look up a little bit further into this whole scene. I think that'll be nice. I don't want to look at the ground, I want to look at the scene ahead. There we go. So those are now our first two keyframes. I'm going from here to the next one. And I'm thinking this is probably a little bit close to the beam for my liking. This could look dramatic, this could look good. I'm not entirely sure yet. All I know is that my next keyframe is already set pretty well. And without doing anything, it looks like my animation is working out pretty well to the next keyframe. So I'm only looking between this keyframe and that keyframe and seeing how that looks. Now I'd like to make one more of an adjustment about here, halfway through. And this is, I like to be away from this building. I would like to be, this shot up to here looks okay. But so from frame 190, that looks kind of okay. But then going further over there, I like my camera to just shift over to the right-hand side a little bit. So what I could do here is move my playhead to about frame 190, at which occasion I know that it looks okay, and set a keyframe manually with a little plus icon here. And once I do that, I know that nothing up until this keyframe will be changed. Because I like to add another keyframe at about frame 250, where the camera position certainly doesn't look great. I'm going to do that by just moving my camera over with the translation tool here. That'll just be an X translation, slightly further over here, keeping in mind that this picture is where I'm going to end up. So let's see what that looks like. From here over to there, I like that much better. But you see, it only took me a single keyframe in the correct position to achieve that effect. Let's apply the same principle between this keyframe now and the last one. I think in this case I need one just about here at frame 370, at which I'd just like to look up at this blue thing up here. So as soon as I change a value, DAZ Studio will set a keyframe automatically. First I'm going to look up a little bit, like this, at high fidelity, and then I'll also pan over here a little bit further. I'll see what that looks like. It could be a little bit wild, but from here over to here, that's nice. And now we're panning down here. Yeah, I think I like that much better. But again, the rule is use as few keyframes as possible to achieve your effect. And that's basically it. There's only one other thing that I would like to change, and I'm going to use KeyMate to do that. So I've set my keyframe here accidentally a little bit too close to the beam. It would be better if this particular keyframe here at frame 90 is probably set at frame 70 without ruining the shot too much. And the easiest way for me to do that would be to just take the position of this keyframe and just move the keyframe slightly further here to frame 70. Sadly, DAZ Studio doesn't offer an option to do that. I could go ahead and make sure I'm parked on that keyframe here and then read out the rotational and translational values here. Maybe make a note on a piece of paper and then set the same values on frame 70 and then delete the keyframe at frame 90. That is one way of doing it. But I think an even better way is to use KeyMate for this and just grab this one keyframe and move it further over to frame 70. Let's do that. With KeyMate selected, I can see the objects in my scene, my sphere that we're not really using, the camera, and the whole set. I can see that on the camera line here, on the camera tab, I have this one keyframe, which is here on frame 90. Nothing happens when I click on it, so I have to kind of drag around it and then select it that way. That's possible. And now I can park my playhead where I'd like that keyframe to be instead, and just left click and drag my keyframe over there. And that'll already show me what the effect will be on that keyframe, and I think this may just look better. KeyMate also has the timeline here, so I can go and shift this around and see if I like that better. Oh dear, see what happened there? We're diving below the ground. But that's easily fixed with another keyframe. We can set that in a moment. I'm even thinking perhaps I should set that keyframe on about frame 60 here. So let me just go move that over here, like so. That's it. I'm really done with KeyMate already. I'm going to go and go back to the regular timeline where you can now see that I haven't got nothing else on frame 90 and everything has moved to frame 60. So that's very, very helpful. That's cool. I like the shot, but of course this needs to be fixed. But that's not a problem really. Where it's at its worst moment, like down here, at say frame 120, I'm going to stay there and then I'm going to use my translational tools and just tweak the Y rotation so that I'm above ground at all times. I like the idea of being above ground and just creeping at the low end as if somebody maybe holds the camera to their feet. There, that could be the animation. I'm thinking perhaps I'm going to be a little bit further above the ground even. The rest is unaffected, of course. Yeah, I think I'll do that. Just go back to frame 120 and then just use the sliders here. You could also go ahead and use the perspective view with the camera selected, by honing in on it, you can just go and drag it up if that's more your style. It really depends on your personal workflow there. Both ideas will work quite nicely. What I like about fiddling with the sliders here is that you see an immediate effect. You see here when I move the camera, I have to let go of it and then the second viewport will update. Whereas with the little sliders here, if I do this, then my viewport updates, both my viewports update more or less immediately. I can go over to the single view and then have a look if my animation looks okay to me if I play this back in real time. The only change perhaps I'd like to make here is that I'm going to go and make the beginning a little bit slower. So I'm kind of crashing in onto the floor way too fast. I think I'm going to remedy this by just starting a little bit less high up. Now to do this, I'm going to go and position my camera on frame 0 again. But of course, now I have to really make sure that my camera is selected in the scene tab. It is just so easy to select something else and then all of a sudden put a keyframe into an object that you didn't want to affect. So make sure you select the camera and just bring the Y translation down a little bit here. Perhaps to here. Let's see what that looks like. Still very dramatic with the beam, but I think I like that much better. And here's the final result, rendered in 30 frames a second and in iRay. Now this takes about, depending on your graphics card, I think you can get away with rendering it at about 200 iterations and the denoiser active. I've also set the light here, that's just the regular sunlight that comes with DAZ Studio. There's no HDRI involved. This is literally just the sun and sky that is set at about 2:30 in the afternoon, and that's the effect. I hope you like this and I hope I could inspire you to do your own fly-through animations with any set you desire. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you next time. Bye bye.